There is a coherent and very logical, a very sensible strategy behind the Trump administration's foreign policy. The Trump administration's moves towards Venezuela, I think, are consistent with the logic of consolidation, which starts by shoring up your own position in your own home area or your own hemisphere. On Greenland itself, my starting point is to say, look, President Trump is right with respect to the goal. The Danes, that they're not really in a position to defend this place, and that sovereignty, integral to a claim of sovereignty, is the ability to secure something. I don't think that most people in either Canada or the United States have interpreted President Trump as saying he literally wants to make Canada the 51st state. I see Trump as a disruptor in kind of a crease point of history where we're transitioning from what's been called the rules-based international order to a more great power or competition-oriented setting. But I see him as a disruptor in an era that required disruption.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Money Macro Talks. Today, we will talk about the grand strategy behind Trump's foreign policy with Dr. Wess Mitchell, who is the author of the book Great Power Diplomacy, The Skill of Statecraft from Attila the Hun to Kissinger. He's also co-founder of the think tank, the Marathon Initiative, and, very relevant for this discussion, he was Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs in the first Trump administration. Wes, to start, I think there's a lot of confusion right now about Trump's recent foreign policy adventures, if we can call them that, capturing Maduro, threatening South American leaders from Colombia to Mexico, perhaps more shockingly to people like me in Europe, threatening to annex Canada and Greenland. To many, these seem like the actions of a madman. In a recent foreign policy article, though, you said, and I quote, Trump's strategic actions, and by extension the NSS, National Security Strategy, are in fact rooted in a clear and compelling logic firmly grounded in the discipline of grand strategy. So, what is this grand strategy that a lot of people are missing behind Trump's foreign policy?
Well, thank you, Joeri, for having me. I'm a big fan of your show, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to be able to participate here as a guest today. As I argue in the article that you're referencing, I think there is a coherent and very logical, a very sensible strategy behind the Trump administration's foreign policy. The term that I have used to describe it and that I use in the article is strategic consolidation. Consolidation is a boring-sounding word, but it's a well-established strategy that great powers in history have used on many occasions to kind of step back from imperial overstretch. This is the strategy that the Emperor Hadrian used to consolidate Roman power after the conquest of Trajan. It's the strategy of Edwardian Britain in the early 1900s when it was faced with the rise of Imperial Germany. But the basic idea of consolidation is very old. It's proactively shore up your position in ways that will increase your disposable power over time. So you're accepting certain trade-offs in the near term, and in parallel, you're taking steps to kind of renovate the underlying structural factors, your alliances, energy, trade, industry, so that you are fortifying your position to prepare for long-term competition. And see consolidation as a logical response to the organizing problem for U.S. national security for some time now, which is what the Pentagon calls the simultaneity problem. And this refers to the fact that the U.S. doesn't currently possess a military capable of defeating all of our main rivals simultaneously in the way that we did after the Cold War. So if, say, Russia and China were to make simultaneous moves against our allies or interests, we wouldn't be in a strong position to resist them. So in other words, there's a gap, and I think it's a significant gap between means at America's disposal in military and economic terms, and the ends to which those means might need to be applied in the form of the threats of the outside environment. So strategy is about matching means to ends. And if I look at the 2025 National Security Strategy or the National Defense Strategy that was just released a few days ago, I read these documents as saying the U.S. will prioritize the places that matter most to our interests, and those are our own hemisphere and the Indo-Pacific. We will still care about other regions like Europe and the Middle East, but we're not going to give them the attention and resources that we did in the past. And we will expect our allies in those places to bear the bulk of the burden for their own security. And then in parallel, we're going to set in motion a kind of revival of the underlying U.S. power base by making some big changes. We're going to encourage reindustrialization, including by restructuring our trade policies towards both allies and rivals. We're going to expand domestic energy production, so we're in a position to increase exports, but also fuel big AI breakthroughs. We're going to deregulate the economy. We're going to expect allies to show reciprocity in both security and trade. All of this, to my mind, follows a clear logic, which is to focus on the most important parts of our security perimeter, while at the same time we're getting ourselves in a better footing for a protracted rivalry with China. I think that logic is clear, and it rests on time-tested principles of strategy and the interests of state that maybe sometimes people are missing or they ignore when they get caught up in the day-to-day furor of politics and foreign policy.
And so we've seen a lot of things in these past few weeks that have surprised many people, right? That do seem like a difference between previous administrations. Specifically, for me at least, what stood out was Argentina's bailout, but also, of course, the capture of Maduro, and then, more alarmingly, the threatening to annex Canada. I don't know if you should read it that way. That's how it comes across, especially with a map that Trump shared. And then finally, the annexing of Greenland. So how do these actions fit into this grand strategy?
Well, I'll start with Venezuela. The Trump administration's moves towards Venezuela, I think, are consistent with the logic of consolidation, which starts by shoring up your own position in your own home area or your own hemisphere. In the book that you mentioned that I've written recently on great power diplomacy, I looked at grand strategies from great powers over about a 1,500-year time frame, and I found that in almost every case, when a great power is confronted with something like this simultaneity problem that I've described, their first move is to shore up the home area and sort of expunge rival influence from their near abroad, kind of get their affairs in order. And I see that at play in the Trump administration's approach in our own hemisphere. I think on Venezuela, what's interesting is that the administration so far has accomplished its goals there with a modicum of military risks and without repeating the mistake of U.S. foreign policy of the recent past of Iraq and Afghanistan and putting boots on the ground. In geopolitical terms, I think the U.S. basically singled out one country in our near abroad that has been the most avowedly antagonistic to the United States and has invited the presence of adversarial powers to our doorstep. And we created a kind of salutary demonstration of our capabilities that other unfriendly countries in our hemisphere will have to pay attention to. We also effectively stopped what had been the ongoing flow of Venezuelan oil to a lot of our opponents. We placed ourselves in a position to meter and regulate that and to recoup some of the lost U.S. energy, the sunk costs of U.S. energy companies whose assets were expropriated in the past in Venezuela. Venezuela has been a major energy supplier to China, for example. In late 2025, Venezuela was shipping around 700,000 barrels per day to China. Now that has fallen by 75 or 80%. The administration is using the leverage from the raid and the oil that it has seized to, I think, prevail upon the Venezuelan government to sort of disgorge the presence of Russia and China and Cuba. We'll see over the long term how amenable the Delcy Rodriguez government proves to those kinds of demands. But it would be hard to think of a more effective way to change the calculus in Venezuela while limiting the costs and risks to the U.S. than the approach that the administration has taken. If you wish, I could move from there to either Greenland or Argentina, whichever you prefer.
So can I just ask some quick follow-up questions on Venezuela first? Specifically, so what I've read from critics of this move, like, for example, Professor John Mersheimer has said, look, there weren't that many real strategic interests in Venezuela. It was nothing like the Cuban Missile Crisis where there was a real threat from an adversary. So that's one line of criticism that I'm just interested to see how you would respond to. And then the second is when it comes to the Venezuelan oil, there was Trump saying, look, we're going to get the oil, and Venezuela looks very impressive on paper, but now you have these major oil companies like Exxon saying, but Venezuela is uninvestable, and China can just buy oil on the international market elsewhere quite easily, right? How would you respond to these criticisms?
Well, I thought Secretary Rubio was very articulate in answering similar criticisms when he testified recently to the Senate. And to my mind, it does boil down to discernible U.S. interests that are at stake in Venezuela, and by extension, the Caribbean and the Western Hemisphere. You can debate the individual tactics or kind of how we go about pursuing those interests, but I think a core tenet of consolidation, kind of as a strategy or as a concept, is devoting attention to places that have been neglected, that fall within your zone of interest. And in the case of Venezuela, again, I'm thinking of Marco Rubio's very articulate presentation to the Senate. You're talking about a country that has exported a very large amount of narcotics into the United States. That's now effectively stopped or mostly stopped. You're talking about a country that has provided a very warm welcome to listening posts and other harmful activities from our rivals on their soil that are close to the United States. That has not fully stopped, but the administration is using the leverage that it's amassed to bring that to a stop. So I think, when you then factor in the energy resource, the oil question, this is a country that in the recent past has provided a large amount of oil, including on the black market, to U.S. adversaries. So I think there's a very compelling prima facie case that the United States was not doing enough in a nearby place in ways that were deleterious to our interests, while we were much more focused and concerned with events further afield in Asia or in East Europe, which I would argue certainly involve U.S. interests, but we were neglecting something that was primary or falls at a much higher echelon of our interests. That's a very compelling case to me, not a hard one to make at all.
But then, okay, so it fits with that. This one fits quite well within the consolidation, a grand strategy, right? And we could argue, of course, about the specifics of how important Venezuela then really is for the broader drug trade out of South America and how important it really is for oil markets. But perhaps this may also just send a message, sort of saying the U.S. is back as a major player in its backyard, and that might be relevant as well. But something that was more difficult to understand, I think, for at least Europeans, and I think many others as well, was the Greenland case, where specifically I read lots of specialist analysis on the minerals that are just not that important, or not, a refinery is far more important than getting the minerals. And then also, of course, that there was already a treaty with Denmark that the U.S. could have the military bases there, that they've been building down their troops there. So I'm really wondering, how does Greenland fit into the grand strategy?
Well, I see the administration's efforts to acquire Greenland or increase U.S. presence there. I see that as consistent with the logic of its overall approach to the world. I think it is both true that the U.S. needs greater access to Greenland for strategic reasons, and that we have a vital interest in preserving NATO. And I think the administration is doing both of those things. But on Greenland itself, my starting point is to say, look, President Trump is right with respect to the goal. The U.S. has strategic interests in Greenland that have not been fully served in the recent past. Some of those are old and I think widely recognized, right? So proximity to northern sea lanes, the Greenland-Iceland UK gap, the Northwest Passage, which is only growing more important as the sea ice melts. Also the location for missile defense batteries for intercepting incoming missiles from Russia or China. But some of the U.S. interests there are newer, or they relate to newer aspects of great power competition. For example, we get satellite feeds overwhelmingly through the polar region, which that's becoming more important as the space race heats up. The polar regions are important in that they provide download points for orbiting satellites that are geometrically stable. For satellites in sun synchronous orbits, they pass at every orbit. That's getting a lot more important as space competition heats up. And then finally, what you alluded to, the natural resource dimension. Greenland is home to very large proven mineral reserves and deposits, including many rare earth minerals that some types of which are found in few other places on Earth, including China. Minerals have always been important in geopolitics, but I think they're now truly massively important because they're integral to semiconductors, and they'll play a big role in the AI arms race that's heating up. So all of that, on the face of it, it's very clear to me that there are U.S. strategic interests at stake in Greenland. The issue, as I see it, is that Denmark has in fact been steadily granting Greenland more autonomy over time, and I think that process is likely to continue in the future. So as that process progresses, eventually we'll arrive at a day when Greenland is independent or something like independent, and we'll have an island of massive geostrategic importance with 50,000 plus inhabitants that is inevitably vulnerable to or attractive for China and Russia to co-opt or have influence over. So I have interpreted President Trump as saying, look, we're going to lay down a clear marker. We won't let that happen. We want to have greater access there, not just from the perspective of bases, but mineral extraction. Here, the critics say we could have gotten the Danes to negotiate by just asking nicely. But I think it's important to bear in mind that we tried that and it didn't work. I mean, when Trump first raised the desire to acquire Greenland in his first term, the Danes categorically rejected it. The Danish prime minister called it absurd. And the Danish government continued that line into Trump's second term. I think Trump's approach had the effect of bringing the Danes to the table, and it looks like a deal is in the works to upgrade the 1951 agreement that would give the U.S. This would give the U.S. greater access while maintaining the status quo on sovereignty, probably, but possibly also greater access to minerals, not just bases. We'll see. But I think the end result of this will be ultimately both greater U.S. presence in Greenland and a stronger NATO all around. But longer term, I think there's still the question of what becomes of Greenland and if and as its autonomy from Denmark, this process of devolution continues. I think these measures address some of our needs and concerns in the short term, but there's a longer term question that's very open in my mind.
So is it then about the fact that Greenland has this plan to become independent of Denmark? If that would not have been the case, if it was proper Denmark, you think this would not have been an issue?
Well, I think it was bound to be the case that the U.S. in the early part of the first century took a greater interest in Greenland for all the reasons I've stated, irrespective of the nature of its relationship vis-a-vis Denmark. It happens to be that Greenland has been increasing in its autonomy, and I think that raises some obvious questions. But I think there is also something to the critique of the Danes that they're not really in a position to defend this place, and that sovereignty, integral to a claim of sovereignty, is the ability to secure something. So I think it was bound that these issues would come up with respect to Greenland. It's a residual issue of the past, all the way back to World War I. U.S. presidents have tried in various ways to acquire Greenland. So I don't think it's altogether new, but I think it's become more urgent and more intense for the reasons of U.S. interests that I've articulated.
But isn't this something that could also have just been handled through NATO, and in the sense that if Russia poses a threat to Greenland, then Denmark is part of NATO, and then just as the Europeans now moved troops to Greenland, which Trump then didn't respond so well to, he responded by threatening tariffs to the European countries that did that. They would have also moved troops there probably if Russia or China threatened it, right?
Yes, well, I think one side effect of this is that NATO is taking and will take Greenland and by extension the Arctic more seriously. I know from my past work, including on a NATO wise men group a few years ago that Secretary General Stoltenberg put together, how hard it has been to get many of the members of NATO to be willing to take the Arctic more seriously. And in Canada in particular in the past has had a concern about militarization of the Arctic, while the Russians are really ramping up. They're not shy about expanding their military presence in the Arctic. And where I may differ with you is I think it was a mistake for the Danes to militarize this issue early on in the dispute with Trump over the past few weeks. Now, the Danish government has claimed in the period since then that this was meant primarily vis-a-vis China and Russia. However, inevitably, in the public perception, in the media, politics, reality is very much about perception and politics. And I think the overwhelming perception was that the military assets were sent there as a message to Trump. And I think that was unhelpful. And I think that did escalate it. And it was after that then that Trump responded with the tariff threats. What looks to me from Trump's recent visit to Europe is that there is a process in place now that Secretary Rubio is leading to renegotiate the 1951 agreement. I think, as I said a moment ago, this will land in a place where we can say it is both true that the U.S. has greater access to Greenland, and that NATO is stronger as an alliance. And bear in mind, I mean, the final point on this is that NATO so the premise of your question is partly correct. NATO can and should do more to defend the Arctic. But when it comes to things like, mineral wealth, the mineral wealth of Greenland, this falls well beyond the remit of Greenland. So I think that helps to explain why the U.S. hasn't seen this as only a NATO issue.
But about the final thing about Greenland, then we can move on to Canada. I'm just wondering, I agree with you. I think, over here in Europe, almost everyone saw sending soldiers there as a signal to Trump, not really as deterrence to Russia or China. I think so. I agree. But wouldn't, if Canada threatened to annex Alaska, wouldn't the U.S. send soldiers to Alaska? Wouldn't it be strange then say, well, that's a bit of an escalatory move by the U.S., given that Canada just threatened to annex their territory?
Well, I think the problem with your counterfactual is that in the case of Canada with Alaska, so let's entertain this for a moment, the problem of the premise is that the United States, which is very powerful and near Alaska, is very much in a position to secure Alaska in a way that benefits Canada. And Canada would have a very weak prima facie argument that it would somehow, as a country of 38 million people, be in a better position to defend Alaska. I don't think that this works, that this analogy works. Now, it is true that the Danes feel very intensely about Greenland, and I think people can see that, and cooler rhetoric, I think, is prevailing. My point is simply, in response to what you said a moment ago about escalation, I saw Trump's threats of tariffs as coming in response to what was widely interpreted as a deterrence move vis-a-vis the United States, and not, as Danish leaders claimed, maybe it was their intent that this be seen, the military deployment be seen as signaling to Trump that Denmark was capable of defending Greenland vis-a-vis Russia and China. But I'm assuming that it was also understood by the Danish government that this would be seen as an escalatory move in Washington. And I'm suggesting that if one has the goal of preserving NATO and seeing Greenland, in a place where it is both better defended and it's contributing to the collective defense of the West in mineral and other terms, that wasn't necessarily a helpful move.
All right. So then let's move on to the final country that has been in news that I think might fit in this strategy, but is potentially even harder for at least people in Europe and I think also in Canada to comprehend. And that is Trump's various, I don't know if you could call them threats or insinuations that Canada should become the 51st American state, and how that has contributed probably to worsened relations with Canada and Canada doing or considering trade deals with China.
Well, I see this as a case where President Trump takes an unorthodox approach to geopolitics. And I think in some instances, he has a negotiating style that starts with a very maximal position. And then, in the knowledge that inevitably in the negotiations, you'll end up somewhat shy of that, but you'll land in a better place than if you had started a more minimalist sort of status quo position. And on Canada, I mean, the fact is we're in the process of and have been in the process of renegotiating certain aspects of our trade relationship with the Canadians. U.S. and Canada have obviously a very old and deep relationship. I don't think that most people in either Canada or the United States have interpreted President Trump as saying he literally wants to make Canada the 51st state. But I do think the president has signaled, and this is where the administration has been on its policy of re-examining a relationship with Canada that hasn't had the degree of reciprocity in trade, for example, that we'll need in an era of great power competition. I think the Canadian response to that, so the trip to Beijing and discussion of a new world order, is I don't take it seriously. So the idea that Canada would pursue a deeper relationship with China, given China's antagonistic kind of posture towards the West and its well-known use of trade as lever of great leverage and influence inside Western countries, it's just not plausible to me, the tacit claim of the Canadians at present that they have a viable option. In fact, I think one interesting thing from a geopolitical perspective about Canada is that in some ways, of all the NATO countries, it has the greatest structural incentives to free riding on U.S. security. The Canadians have kept their defense spending near the bottom of the NATO alliance. So I think they're 1.3 or 1.35 or 7% of GDP is spent on defense. And so they rank in a tier of sort of like Luxembourg and Belgium. And the fact is, precisely because their territory sits right next to the United States, the most powerful military on earth, I think they have this ability to justify to themselves an even higher degree of free riding than you see in other countries in the NATO alliance. But I think the idea that a country that sits this close to the United States would have a security or economic alternative to the United States in the form of China, I just don't take it seriously.
But what do you think about the, I don't know if blowback is the right term, just a more general point that, and maybe these are Trump's tactics rather than the strategy, right? Like you talk about the strategy of retreating to your own hemisphere, and I can see how the Greenland story and the Canada story, although one kind of disagree about whether you should do that or not, fit into that strategy. But then the tactics maybe have been very controversial in the sense, what you also mentioned, that Trump takes this very maximalist position. And I think you've seen both in Europe and Canada quite a big counter reaction to that, right? Like public opinion really souring on America, and well, Canada starting to talk to China, which, okay, fair enough if you say, well, is that really realistic given their economic proximity to the US? But also in Europe, where lots of governments are now working to try to rid themselves of their dependence on US tech giants, and our governments are thinking about not relying on US arms anymore. So that seems like quite a big sort of counter reaction, and not very much in the US interest, right? But okay, I can imagine there's costs and benefits. So I'm wondering how you see that that relationship. Like, what was it worth it?
Well, in my view, so I see the Trump administration as saying to Europe, we need to fundamentally update and revise the terms of our bargain with Europe as allies. The old bargain comes from the end of World War II, and it was basically that the U.S. would provide military protection, and we would open up our markets to Europe on a non-reciprocal basis. And then in exchange, the Europeans provided certain things: access to bases, a certain degree of political fealty, you could say, support for the U.S. dollar, recycling their surpluses into U.S. bond and equity markets to fuel U.S. consumption. And so that bargain made sense after World War II, when the U.S. economy made up a much larger share of global trade. But I think it makes much less sense at a moment when the European market and population base are larger than that of the United States. And when we're trying to manage this large security perimeter that I've described with multiple threats. So in those circumstances, the Atlantic bargain has got to evolve in big ways. In security, obviously, it's about more burden sharing. Europeans can't expect the U.S. to care more about European security than they do. And the share of their state income, GDP, that they put towards social programs relative to defense clearly is going to have to change. I think in trade, there has to be a greater reciprocity, or just flat openness of the European market to U.S. products in a way that there wasn't in the past, for the U.S. to be able to even partially reindustrialize in the way that we need for sustained competition with China. And you mentioned technology. I mean, I think here we can't continue with an arrangement of the kind that we've had in the past, where the U.S. produces innovations, which Europe is incapable of producing for a variety of reasons right now, and which the U.S. I'd say the West collectively needs in order to ensure our own security. Europe positions itself as sort of a rent seeker, or to tax and regulate these innovations. So I read the Trump administration as saying, we want to revise the terms of our basic deal, or our bargain. We're not leaving NATO. We're not burning down the Western alliance, as some have claimed, but we want the West to be strong materially again. And to get there, we're going to have to alter course in certain ways. So in other words, I see Trump as a disruptor in kind of a crease point of history, where we're transitioning from what's been called the rules-based international order to a more great power or competition-oriented setting. But I see him as a disruptor in an era that required disruption. And I think the Atlantic Alliance, at the end of all this, will be stronger. NATO will be spending more money than it did previously on defense, et cetera. But as with any era of disruption, a big part of diplomacy is to resolve these asymmetries or these paradoxes. It's both true that we need greater reciprocity in trade and greater burden sharing in NATO, and that we need to preserve our alliances. So I think that's going to be the art form for U.S. statecraft, both in the latter half of the second Trump administration and beyond. But I would just say one more thing, that the U.S.-Europe relationship has, I think it's easy to forget in retrospect the size of some of the past challenges to this relationship. The tensions in the transatlantic relationship when I was in grad school over the Iraq War, at that time people said, we've never seen anything like this. The Europeans are going to go their own way. The alliance is over. I mean, the German debate about U.S. missiles in the 90s, the near rupture under Nixon. I mean, the debate about Korea and Charles de Gaulle pulling France out of the military command. I was actually reading the other day about an episode where things were so bad in the U.S.-French relationship that Dean Rusk called his French counterpart and asked rhetorically if the United States should be exhuming the bodies of our soldiers from the cemeteries in Normandy. My point is that this is an old and deep relationship. It has a lot of resilience and ability to absorb these storms, and I think the Atlantic Alliance will come out stronger from all of this.
No, I think it's good, and it's partially also why I wanted to get you on, given that you have a deep insight into the history of all of this. I think it's good to indeed, like, sometimes look back, because it's easy to forget that there have been very, very big crises in this relationship before. And I also see your point where you say, look, and I think many people in Europe see this, that the global economic deal that was there, I think it worked in the US's favor, given that they were the architect of that deal, and they are very smart people. I don't think they in the time it was a good deal for them, but I also agree that it was a good deal for Europe to rebuild Europe after the Second World War specifically. And I think everybody already agreed that this system was coming to an end, was not sustainable. And I can see the argument that you're making, like, look, so many presidents from the US had already said, look, we need to rebalance. Europe needs to do more military for its own defense. And I think many people here in Europe also agree that should be the case. So in that sense, it makes sense that maybe a disruption was needed. And I can see that argument, absolutely. I would like to get into one final thing, and then we can maybe move on towards more sort of where the system is going next, just from this European-US relationship perspective. And that was in the national security strategy. I read something that I found a little bit alarming, which was sort of language that hinted at political interference from the US in Europe to get it into a certain direction. And you also wrote in your FP article that Bismarck famously also interfered in Austro-Hungarian internal affairs to make it sort of more pro-German at the time. And that this is very much a realist sort of thing to do. And I was wondering, was that hinting at, it's fine for the US to interfere in European democracies?
Yes. Well, before I answer that, let me make one very short comment in response to what you were saying just a moment ago that I think is important to grasp and maybe for your viewers to think about. And it is this reality that alliances, let's say, and the underlying bargains that they inevitably reflect are not static, and nor are our institutions or anything that man makes. But these bargains evolve over time. And I see what Trump is doing is actually the third big, let's call it a renovation or renegotiating of the bargain between Europe and the United States. The first one, I would argue, was under Nixon, with the closing of the gold window, the Smithsonian agreement. If you remember the Guam doctrine, where Nixon basically said the United States we expect our allies, at that time it was especially in Asia because we were trying to get out of Vietnam, to carry more of the burden for their own defense. We're going to continue to support you and honor our treaty, particularly in nuclear terms, everything else, but we need you to, carry more of the burden. But that was a renegotiation of the basic bargain in U.S. relations with allies, and in particular with Europe, it turned out. The second one, I think, was Reagan, and I'm thinking of the Plaza Accords. Mm-hmm. So it was adjustments in both our economic and security posture. A lot of Europeans hated Reagan at a level that maybe, they've hated him almost as much as they've hated Trump. But I say that just to point out that I think these bargains that underlie an alliance inevitably do and must evolve. And I would be much more worried if we were trying to think of the Atlantic relationship as being somehow an amber, I think it would become, this would be rigid. And it's taken a lot to get the Europeans' attention on things like self-defense and security. I think that increasingly they're there. But I see this as, these are big system level issues. We're talking about alliances and the bargains underlying them. And you can't turn these things on a dime. And so sometimes it takes a disruption, it takes a shock even to get countries to change these big patterns. And it remains to be seen how much these shocks actually do change the underlying policies of the Western world. But we shouldn't be under any doubt that they need to be changed, that the old approach, the status quo approach, was taking us into a place that we don't want to be. And so what I credit Trump most for, whether you like his tactics or not, I think it's like Kissinger said of Trump, right? It's that he is one of these individuals that comes along in history that is changing things in a way that, he's acting as a prompt or a spur in history to move it along to a different plateau or outcome than it otherwise would have. I think there's a lot of merit to that way of thinking about him. A lot of this, the creative destruction that he generates, it does positives, but it also has to be channeled towards constructive outlets. But to answer your question on Europe specifically, I would say this, that Europeans, for some time, European politicians, including in the most recent U.S. presidential election, were not shy at all about wading into American domestic politics. I'm talking about public endorsements of certain candidates in American politics that have come from European heads of state. So whether you think that's a good idea or a bad idea, I think we have to acknowledge that that has been the case. And so the idea that the U.S., by criticizing Europe for domestic policies, that's somehow breaking from a norm is just not true in my mind. And by the way, European leaders have often waded into our hottest domestic debates over social issues. I mean, I remember Macron and other leaders in Europe having very opinionated public responses to the decision that came down a few years ago in the U.S. Supreme Court on abortion and to other, U.S. Supreme Court decisions. So I think we have to just start by saying that if there's an idea that somehow politics has stopped up the water's edge when Europe looks at the United States, it's just not so. I think the heart of the Trump administration message to Europe is wake up. You're in a deep funk. That funk is both material and, let's say, spiritual or non-material in nature. You're mired in regulations that cripple your own economies. You've neglected your defenses. You have large numbers of unassimilated migrants, including many of these. We're talking about large numbers of military-age young men who are recent arrivals from societies who are in many cases antagonistic to our fundamental Western civilization and history. And I think so in other words, the message from the Trump administration is both a geopolitical or, let's say, military security message, trade, et cetera, but it is something deeper. And I look at the European response. I think in defense, Europe has to be capable of carrying the bulk of the burden for defending its own continent. I think most European countries, certainly not all, but most, including especially Germany, I think have gotten that memo. It's clear to me that they have. I don't know it's
100%.
Fully recognized in the United States, the extent to which the Germans have awakened, but I've studied Germany a long time, and I think that the needle has moved. In energy, I think, Europe has to get over the net zero and climate fixation that's sapping your economic growth. We talked about technology, and the U.S. certainly doesn't want to be an island of innovation between a China that steals it and a Europe that taxes it. So there's got to be a modus vivendi on technology, but also at home. I mean, domestically, Europe has to get serious about its borders and the scale of the migration problem, which is now undeniable in both its social and its security implications. But I think the common thread in all of these things is you have to take this seriously, not only because it's in the U.S. interest, but because it's in your existential interest to do so. You may not like the messenger, but I think the messenger is right.
But then what about the Bismarck comment that you made in that article? Because that hints at a little bit more than, because how you said it now, it's like, okay, European politicians have commented on U.S. affairs, and I agree, I could concede that point for sure. But now how you're presenting it now is like, and U.S. officials talk about European politics, of course. But then why did you feel the need to make that sort of Bismarck comment in the FP article? Isn't there more going on here?
But listen, Joeri, I always welcome the opportunity to talk about Bismarck and the Austro-Hungarian Empire that are very dear to my heart. Actually, in the article, I alluded to that example to show that, in fact, even among the closest allies throughout history. Politics has very rarely stopped at the water's edge. And Bismarck actually, remember, his goal was to preserve the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's not a perfect analogy in many ways, but what I think, where the analogy fits, I think, is that Bismarck saw himself as playing internally in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in way more aggressive ways than what we're talking about here. But the various factions that would turn Vienna towards either a more pro-Russian or pro-German or other, but he saw all of this as being necessary to keep this construct, this very unlikely polyglot multinational construct. He wanted to preserve it. He saw it as a bulwark against geopolitical chaos. He turned out to be right, because once the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed after World War I, this became a vacuum that was, helped sow the conditions for the Second World War. But the point of alluding to that example would be to say, even among the closest allies, it's not somehow this unheard of, outrageous thing that you are monitoring, have strong opinions about, and express concern over the internal affairs of an ally. I think in the history of NATO, I think that there's a long history of, on both sides of the Atlantic, at looking under each other's hood and commenting on or responding to things that are that we don't, When I think of, for example, of J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference last year, I think many of the things that he articulated may have seemed strange or alien to European leaders, especially from a progressive standpoint, or let's say the mainstream of European leaders. But he reflected accurately concerns and perceptions that American conservatives have had about Europe and its civilizational direction for a very long time. And I think migration would be the most dramatic of those, but also concerns about what, things that happen in Europe that from a U.S. perspective would be seen as violations of free speech. So again, Europeans may not like the messenger, but I don't think it's unprecedented, and I don't think the message is necessarily wrong. I think the vast majority of what Vance said about Europe in that speech was right.
Okay, then that makes clear what you meant by that. I think I myself, I was a little bit confused what you meant by it, given that I've just recently been reading about more and more money from the US, but that mainly comes from private individuals, private donors in the US coming into European politics. And that would be something that might worry me a little bit. And I do just want to say for the listeners that I very respectfully disagree with you on some of the points you've made, but we just don't have the time to get into it. But specifically, I'm doing some research on the effects of migration in Europe and on the effects of regulation. And I've been looking at indexes of free speech where most European countries are still scoring higher than the US right now. But I just want to, that's for the listener to look into, I think, because you're an expert on great power politics, and now I have you on, I still want to use the time to talk about that. So specifically, this I think is the biggest point. We are moving into a new world order. I think almost everybody agrees on that. And you say, look, we're moving into a new world order of great power politics. And I'm really wondering, do you think that is a good thing, or are you mourning the liberal international order?
Well, I think it was an inevitable thing. You made a comment earlier which stuck with me about these orders and institutional arrangements that are made by a great power. In this case, the U.S. played a very strong role in creating the world as we know it. It's true. But what's interesting to me from a historical perspective is, just like everything else I was talking about a moment ago, alliances and institutions, and these are not fixed in stone. And, I've always been of the view that institutions don't generate power. They're not a form of power in their own right. They reflect and ratify underlying power realities. And when those power realities shift, the institutional superstructure or outworking that has arisen in these ordering moments does have to evolve. And I think what happened after the Cold War is our ideals in the West were so triumphant that they habituated us to this very permissive, almost greenhouse-like environment that has not been the norm in history at all. But an environment where we could reasonably expect, if you go back to the heady days of the mid-90s and you're reading Fukuyama, and it seemed to a lot of people in the West like history truly was over. We were entering this post-heroic age. There was no future but liberalization. First, an economic liberalization, and then sort of, the Goldman Sachs corollary of there being a political liberalization, including in big Eurasian powers like Russia and China that were or were destined to become our rivals. And I think what you can say now when you look back on that is it was an illusion that, at its heart, the neoliberal idea, the premise of it goes back to Immanuel Kant. This idea that mankind can build structures to govern the affairs of nations in the way that we do our domestic affairs that will eventually allow us to transcend geopolitics and abolish war. I think this era of the creation of what people refer to as a rules-based international order, which, by the way, is a very gauzy notion, but I think it became to be seen as an end in its own right. But I think the fundamental proposition of the post-Cold War moment has been shown to be demonstrably false. That, in fact, I think the post-1991 world was an anomaly, and now the world is reverting to conditions that have existed for millennia, powerful states competing for resources, territory, and prestige. I think the U.S. has been late to wake up to that reality, but we have. And what I would say is, while I don't pine for an RBIO that I'm not entirely sure ever really existed in the way that people think about it as a conservative, and I say that also in the geopolitical sense, I do want to see the great power era that we're moving into as much stability as possible, the U.S. to retain certain attributes of the system that we're moving out of that have been beneficial to us and to our allies. I'm preservationist in outlook, in other words. So I see a role for disruption, but the goal should be to steer it towards outcomes that retain and preserve certain goods, certain positives. So the status of the dollar, the fact of our alliances in the rimlands, certain attributes of the current system are salutary and need to be retained, but it'll take some adjustments and disruption to get us there.
But I noticed that a lot of these attributes that you mention are sort of really in the U.S. national interest, and that's totally consistent with sort of the philosophy that you talk about a lot in your articles, etc. I'm wondering, do you also feel like it's worth it to save some elements of that are more humanitarian in nature, in the sense that, and I don't mean nation building in Iraq or something like that, but I mean more like respecting borders, saying, look, borders are as they are and they're fixed, which was part of the United Nations Charter, right? And respecting humanitarian rights. Okay, maybe we're no longer able to enforce this all across the world, but maybe at least in the Western world. Like these kind of, and keeping stuff like international organizations like European Union, which, being in Belgium, being between two major European powers, so far, I'm quite happy that we're no longer a buffer state. And finally, also maybe the IMF and the World Bank that, to my eyes or view, have sort of depoliticized somewhat. I'm in a currency crisis. I don't need to rely on my great power friend like it used to be the case, and is increasingly again the case, but I just need to manage my economy well. And if I manage my economy well, I can get a loan from the World Bank, rather than if I'm friends with the US, I can get a loan to develop.
Well, what I would say is that, of course, it is proper and right and good that as an American, I'm looking at these things manifestly from the standpoint of what's best for the U.S. national interest. And I think it's important that we do that. And I think the Trump administration's basic critique is right, that in many cases, the U.S. in recent years kind of levitated and came away from that prioritization of the national interest. But I would argue that the promotion of the U.S. national interest in 20th century, on more occasions than not, aligned with and furthered the national interests of countries in the West and in Europe. I mean, our alliances were in a much different place after World War II as a result of the arrangements that the United States developed with its allies than we were in previous decades, when the U.S. would kind of have to wade into European politics like a fireman ever so often. The U.S. was, as you know, an architect of the European integration project. But the form of what the U.S. was encouraging was very different from what the European Union is now. I mean, it was a defensive union. It was a federal construct. There was a high degree of subsidiarity. The principles of things like, look at the Treaty of Rome. It was a fundamentally free market oriented construct. I think there's a reasonable critique from the standpoint of European interests. I'm thinking of the Draghi report of 2 years ago, for example, that it's in the European interests in many cases to move back to certain principles of what this was about in the first place. I'm certainly not under any illusion that European and American interests are always identical, but I think they align far more often than they don't, to the point that hypothetically tomorrow, if there were no NATO, and I am as someone who has long studied the Atlantic world and considered myself an Atlanticist, I am not arguing for that. But even if it weren't there, the interests of the U.S. and Europe are aligned to an extent that you would have to create something like it. But I think, to answer your question, the great power competition, you do see an emphasis on certain traditional things. I mean, you mentioned borders. Of course, I think of Westphalia. This is the classical state system, one of the pillars of the Westphalian European state system that far predates the modern world. But, again, citing Kissinger always said, order consists of two things: legitimacy and power. And I think both of those are in flux as we transition from what we've seen in the post-Cold War moment to an era of great power competition. They're very much in flux. Power, meaning the balance of power, is shifting. Legitimacy, I can't, and I think this gets at the heart of your question about underlying principles. I can't conceive of anything that the large powers of the world right now would agree to in terms of the recognized legitimate aims of foreign policy. I think the revisionist powers, Russia and China, have fundamental territorial claims against the system. But what I think should be the goal of diplomacy and is obtainable is, maybe it's not that we're going to have a common view. I think these will be antagonistic to us, meaning the U.S. and to the West, but a cohabitation, a modus vivendi. We can still aspire to stability, and we can aspire to order in the sense of avoiding great power war, maybe not at the level that Woodrow Wilson would have wanted, or, the architects of the modern United Nations, but a reasonable and attainable, what the NDS calls a decent peace, I think is attainable.
All right. That's a great sentence to end on, I think. I promise to respect your time. So thank you so much for coming on, Wes. I think this is a perspective that a lot of viewers have not yet heard of, or at least have only partially heard. And so I think this will provide a lot of value to them. And that's the aim of the show. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Joeri. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm a fan and appreciate you including me.